Chris, thank you very much. And your question just then was one that we may try to answer during this talk, but I'm delighted to be here. And as you've mentioned, Laurens Veen will be talking with me. Pride of place in this meeting goes to discussions of coupling schemes, and Laurens is overseeing and developing the latest version of an environment called Muscle, so Muscle 3, which has been designed to sort of bolt together in a flexible way single scale models and apply them in diverse circumstances. I'll try to start this talk off with the broader context, because I'm running one of these cross-cutting ExCALIBUR projects just like yours, and I think there's plenty of scope to interact with you. And our cross-cutting one connects multiscale and other things. I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the background to it. And one of the talks that's central to this, and the use case that's central to us, is actually the nuclear fusion case, and that's illustrated on that first slide, but I'll come back to that shortly. This is the detail of our project. It's called SCEMa, and it's going to be running for 3 years. So the main thing here is to advocate and support people who are interested in what we call VVUQ, validation, verification, and uncertainty quantification. This is growing in interest across all of the computational sciences, I'd say, because of the need to have credible outcomes from studies. But of course, if you can do them on real world scenarios and fast enough, you've got the opportunity potentially to deliver actionable results, which means they're fast enough to influence decisions that people may take. And those decisions could be rather mundane, or they might be life threatening and life resolving in other instances. I think the most well-known case is weather forecasting today, where it's done pretty well, so that the actionable outcome from a weather forecast today about the next day or two tells you whether you might bring an umbrella with you when you go into work and so on. So that's the general background. All these problems tend to be complicated because they're real world things. They are multi-scale and multi-physics problems. So there's always coupling involved. For us, of course, coupling is in a sense only the start, because then we have to apply uncertainty quantification and these other things to a coupled scheme. And that's probably reasonably well described as state of the art in terms of research in that field itself. The diversity of the domains is indicated. Let me just show the architectural diagram, this layered picture, where most of what we'll talk about later is going to be in the central toolkit layer. We'll talk about the fusion case a little bit and some others, and of course the execution layer. We're interested in getting our hands on large supercomputers, heading, as I say, to the emerging exascale. So just to give a flavor of the domains we're interested in here, they're quite diverse, and that's what we find attractive about this. We've always believed that there are generic aspects to coupling schemes and also to applying things like VVUQ, which has led us to enjoy a large amount of funding over several years, many years now, really, particularly from the European Union in areas like future emerging technologies for high performance computing, and really SCEMa as a kind of UK projection of some of that work at a time when people here are becoming interested in the same things. So I mentioned fusion energy. What's really interesting about that at the moment is its sort of apparent timeliness to address problems with energy, environmental issues and so on. That's ultimately the ideal form of energy if we can harness it. And the UK has a green energy strategy, which, whether you believe it or not, declares that we'll have a fusion reactor on the national grid in the early 2040s. And if you think about that, that means it's less than 20 years from now. So we must believe that fusion energy is going to be harnessable within far less than the familiar "it's always 30 years away" scenario. So there's quite a bit of funding and interest in that at the moment. Other areas of interest are biomedical. That's where you can immediately see, if you're able to make high fidelity simulations very quickly, you could have an opportunity to produce actionable decisions at the sharp end of maybe clinical decision making, where ultimately lives might really be at stake and so on. So all of these things are folded in. It's an interesting kind of area. Just to talk quickly about the diversity of these applications, some things we do in materials science are ones that couple directly now continuum scale models that might be appealing to phenomena, the design of aerospace parts and so on, meters, seconds, but they use advanced materials which are comprised of nanoparticles. They could be, topical things like graphene or other low-dimensional materials, which the presence of which can massively influence the materials properties at large scale, and yet clearly they're of atomistic dimensions, certainly in some of their 3 dimensions, and so they defy and defeat attempts to model them by continuum methods. So there are techniques that we and others try to develop there, in which we couple from a driving upper level of the finite element scheme, a drop down to all atom representation in areas where there's interesting properties to be derived. Rather than using empirical constitutive relations, we'll compute all those things on the fly. That leads you to very challenging situations where you might be doing at all the quadrature points in a finite element calculation, molecular dynamics simulations, and those will start dragging on you, just as Chris's question was posed earlier, for which you can imagine you might end up spending an awful lot of your time just doing MD simulations. These codes at the moment do scale quite well to intermediate levels. On a large supercomputer in Germany, for instance, we've been able to get this coupled code at the moment up to of the order of 100,000 CPUs, and its performance is pretty good at that stage. It could be improved beyond that point. At the moment, it tends to keel over, and there's plenty more that we can do to improve it. But my message here today is not so much on that. It's more about how we connect these two things together and then measure uncertainties that emanate from them. And indeed, one of the problems we're faced with is this disparity in length and time scales between the lower and the upper time and space scales, such as occurs in the fusion problem that I'm coming to. And that's where we invoke a concept that's sort of gaining quite wide currency in jargon terms. That's use of surrogate models. So instead of trying to run all these expensive atomistic models in their full glory, we're going to find a way of capturing what really matters from them and running them fast enough that it doesn't delay the upper level that can run a lot more quickly. So going now to the software environment that we work with, this is actually taking a step back. The project called VECMA, which is the most recent one of these activities we've been involved in for VVUQ in particular, is about to come to an end, but it's enjoyed 3 or 4 years of substantial funding, during which we've been able to put together a whole range of software pieces, services, and tools that can do a variety of things that are interesting from the perspective of validation, verification, and uncertainty quantification. Most of what I'm going to speak about here is UQ, uncertainty quantification. And one of the workhorses that we do have involved here is called ESE VVUQ. We do think it is quite an easy thing to use. We have many users well outside the original grouping that's initiated this. And in fact, the work we do now with the UK Atomic Energy Authority is part of the ExCALIBUR program. We have some funding dedicated from UK AEA, and their project is called Neptune, to develop this fusion software ab initio with UQ embedded from the start as the software that, if the government's dream is to be realized, does see us with a fusion power plant on the grid by 2040 or so, and we could have a software capability here that's acting in this sort of actionable way, can provide information to operators on how to keep the plasma stable. But the big picture here is there's components, they interoperate, and the top right-hand picture here is actually showing a sort of tube map in which, depending on which application area you're in, you might want to collect different components and bolt them together. And where there's coupled models involved, we do have the interest of using the muscle code. So we'll come to that shortly. So the picture where it's generic in terms of coupled models is illustrated in this figure, and it's just reiterating what I showed you really for what we call the heterogeneous multiscale representation for the advanced material case I illustrated. That is where you have some upper level and a lower level, which are doing computations at substantially different compute intensities and time to get solutions. And the full problem is the one on the left-hand side, where the mu stands here for the micro model will usually be much more expensive, and you'll have to do a lot of sampling of it in order to put information into the upper level. So you're risking waiting an awfully long time before advancing the longer time steps above. Whereas if you can find a way of replacing that expensive model by a surrogate, then you hope that that has the correct sort of statistical properties and it will run much faster. That's generally where a lot of the action is, and it will be the case in the fusion instance as well. So in these problems, this project SCEMa and VECMA as well, we have a structure where we look at theory and algorithms and then developments that lead to implementations and software. This picture is, slide is really just showing you the sort of theoretical end of the game with very simple toy models. This is a particular toy model that was developed by Ed Lorenz. His most famous model is from 1963, but he also has an interesting one from 1996, which is slightly different in its details. I'm not going to go into all of the structure here, but it's actually a toy model for the atmosphere at a constant latitude. And because, as we'll know, in all of the problems where we have challenges, there's stochastic elements in the simulation. Clearly, turbulence is prevalent in weather forecasting. That's also central to plasmas and their instabilities. In molecular dynamics, although it's far less recognized, all MD simulations are also chaotic. So we have to be able to tame that instability and uncertainty during the simulations. In this model, what's actually happening is we've got a coupling of the upper level in capital X with another model, which is also a Lorenz 96 model that's representing the subgrid model that's not actually computed in the sort of full dynamic direct numerical simulation sense. And one is interested in seeing how you can replace that lower level model with some kind of surrogate, which in this case is of a stochastic kind. And that's led to some interesting findings that are currently being pursued. It's only been looked at so far in the two-dimensional case here, but there's more to come. So now I'm actually getting onto the plasma case, and this is the picture that I want to just talk you through briefly here, because plasma dynamics must rate as one of the most challenging multi-scale problems that we have to deal with in these contexts, certainly that I'm aware of. It's probably involving ultimately something like 9 different levels of representation that we try to connect together. Although the figure on the left that adorned the front slide that I gave as well is more of a slight simplification of that, in which we deal with only some of the dynamics. So the problem with plasmas is that they have micro instabilities that develop and drive turbulence, and that affects the overall transport and can destroy confinement. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to sustain it. If you're doing modeling and simulation here, well, the situation is there are a lot of efforts that are ongoing to construct multi-scale simulation models for tokamak physics. So the tokamak is the magnetic, the structure that's used to confine in a toroidal geometry a plasma using magnetic fields. There's a problem here that there's a huge disparity between turbulence in the plasma and transport, which is the thing that leads to stabilities and instabilities and the failure to sustain its operating conditions. So we're going to try and do multi-scale fusion workflows with modeling and simulation. People and we have, with our collaborators, taken a component-based approach here. So you will couple single-scale models between which information flows. And the diagram is trying to show you that there's a kind of topology code, it's called ETS, that computes the plasma profiles which we're interested in, things like the densities and temperatures of the electrons in the plasma and other charged species. This goes through to an equilibrium code, which is actually the net, it's named on this slide as cheese, and that updates the plasma equilibrium geometry. From that, the data is fed into a turbulence code, and there are various sorts of turbulence codes, the trivial toy models, which don't cost much, and the much more expensive gyroelectromagnetic calculations, which are expensive, and they calculate the fluxes. Those fluxes get taken over to the transport code, and they go into the transport coefficients that are required there. So that's the overall picture, and one is trying to compute what's going on in these systems, and you have a problem, needless to say, that you have to worry about the uncertainties that creep into your scenarios. And so you've got a multi-scale problem where uncertainty in one part of the model may influence strongly that going on in others. And these figures here, I don't have time to go into in any detail, look at what you can deal with in these problems today. One of the challenges is how many dimensions in your parameter space can you actually track? That's computationally a big problem in uncertainty quantification. In this study, which was led by David Koster at the Max Planck Gesellschaft Institute of Plasma Physics in Garching in Munich, they were looking at the application of what's called polynomial chaos expansions to handle 10-dimensional parametric space, that is, where the parameters have uncertainty and how that influences the outcome of the predictions. And so those things need to be done, and you can plot these performances from the code. You can use a range of different uncertainty quantification capabilities. And I would say the biggest challenge here for the longer term is how you integrate really large numbers of parameters into these problems, because most of the current approaches, such as polynomial chaos or stochastic collocation, handle quite well up to maybe 10 or 20 parameters, but then essentially they are daunted by what we call the curse of dimensionality and start to grind to a halt. So we're on the lookout for smarter and quicker ways of handling increasingly high dimensional problems. Let me see where I can take this next. So one other aspect when you're doing uncertainty quantification is ensembles. That's what happens in a weather forecast. That's why they need a very large supercomputer. They typically run about 50 different sort of instances of the evolving weather, utilizing variations in the parameters that have uncertainties and recognizing the stochasticity in the dynamics as well. So you need to have a system that will deploy large numbers of instances of these calculations. And we use pilot job methods to do this. And this is just an example of trying to deploy some of our software called the QCG pilot job on the Archer 2 system recently, where we were able to get good sustained performance up to of the order of 100,000 cores, running a whole bunch of different ensembles to do these kinds of stochastic collocation and polynomial chaos expansion calculations. But when you get to much larger levels, there are still major issues about how you can continue to support the scaling. I think at this point, I'm going to hand over to Laurens, because he's going to talk about the heart of the problem from the perspective of this meeting. That's muscle 3 and how that works. Laurens, are you able to hear me and take over? Because I will drive the slides as you request.
Yes, Peter, thank you. My Zoom seems to be experiencing some slowdowns, so I hope we're going to make it to the end of this presentation, but I'll do my best. So muscle 3 is the third version of muscle, which development of which started about 10 years ago at the Computational Science Lab of the University of Amsterdam. Muscle 3 is a collaboration with the Netherlands eScience Center, where I work as a research software engineer, and where I also manage our small but extant internal research and development project on model coupling. Next slide, please. So why muscle 3 and not the previous muscle 2 and the original muscle? Well, as Peter said, for uncertainty quantification, you need ensembles. And one way to do that is to use EasyViewQ, as you can see here on the right. What EasyViewQ does is it samples the uncertain input parameters, generates a set of them for each of those runs the model and collates all the results and then analyzes the results. And you can do that regardless of what is the model. It's a black box function. So for that, you can, and we have used EasyView together with Muscle to do the model coupling. Now, for the semi-intrusive methods, this no longer works because the semi-intrusive methods take into account both the fact that we are coupling models and the fact that we have an ensemble. And they exchange information between the ensemble members. So you can no longer run those HTC style as a bunch of different jobs on a cluster. Even using a pilot job framework is not going to help because that still doesn't guarantee that they're actually active at the same time and can exchange information. So this is where Muscle 3 comes in and has explicit support for this. Some other reasons were that Muscle 2 was written in Java, which doesn't talk to C++ or Fortran very well. Muscle 3 has a better API, and it uses a YAML-based file for its configuration, which is nicer than XML, or even a Ruby script as in the original. Next slide, please. So to show how this works, I'm going to use this model, which is also from the UVA Computational Science Lab. It's called instant restenosis. In the interest of time, I will skip the full explanation, but what you're looking at here is a longitudinal cross-section of a coronary artery, which is being treated by inserting a stent, that's a cylindrical wire mesh, into the artery, expanding it, that's from the left to the middle picture. And then we simulate the healing process because this damages the artery. And so cells start growing to repair the damage. But unfortunately, in some cases, too many cells, the cell growth keeps going and it fills up the artery again. And you need renewed treatment in order to avoid a heart attack. So there are three processes in the simulation, one of which is the stent deployment. The second one is the cell growth process, and the third one is the flow of the blood through the lumen, which is the open area in the middle of the artery. These are all connected, so obviously the cell growth modifies the geometry of the artery and therefore influences the flow of the blood. But vice versa, also the cells can sense the wall shear stress that is placed upon them by the blood flow. And if the wall shear stress gets too high, they will stop growing. So both processes interact with each other. Next slide, please. So if we look at this from a technical perspective, you can look at the time and space in which these processes take place, and we can see that the stent deployment and the cell model both affect the wall of the artery, while the blood flow takes place in the lumen. So there are two domains which are adjacent, so they share a boundary. And also in time, we can see that the stent deployment happens first, after which the other two processes occur simultaneously. So on the right, you see a scale separation map. This is a bit of a tricky diagram if you haven't seen one before, but what it shows is temporal and spatial scales of the processes. So the lower bounds of these boxes are the granularity, the time step, size of the agents, the grid spacing, and the upper bounds are the extent. So this is the size of the domain and the total time taken for the model to reach an equilibrium. What we can see here is that the cell model is much slower than the blood flow model. The cell model has a time step of about an hour. Blood flow is much faster than that, on the order of less than a second. So what we have here is timescale separation, and with that, this is a multiscale model. Now, this is actually all the information we need to couple the models using Muscle. But we need one more thing, which is an answer to the question, what is a model? That's on the next slide. What you see here is the submodel execution loop. This is Muscle and the multiscale modeling and simulation framework, which is a theory behind it. This is its idea of what a submodel is. It says a submodel starts by being initialized, during which it can obtain some information from the outside world. Then we enter the state update loop, which starts with producing some intermediate output. Then we update the state, possibly receiving some input, maybe boundary conditions. And then we loop this any number of times. And finally, we reach a final state, which we can then once again share with the outside world in a final output. This is a very flexible model. The loop doesn't actually have to step through time. The materials model that Peter was talking about actually has Newton-Raphson iteration in here as well. You can run the loop 0 times, in which case your model is simply a function. Next slide, please. So putting all of this together, what we can see on the left is how this model is coupled. The stent deployment produces a final state, which is sent to the cell model used to initialize it. And after that, I'm sorry. After that, the cell model and the blood flow model run simultaneously and exchange information by sending messages back and forth. You can see a timeline on the right. Next slide, please. So how is that implemented with muscle? At runtime, this simulation looks like this. Each of the submodels runs as a separate process, and it's linked to the muscle library. When it starts up, it will open up a network socket, and it will then contact the manager and tell the manager, this is where I am on the network. The manager will read the configuration file, and which contains the topology of the simulation. And it will then inform all the models which peers they should be connecting to and where those peers can be found on the network. The peers will then set up peer-to-peer network connections, currently using TCP, but I'm hoping to do RDMA in the future. And that will allow them to communicate peer-to-peer, which is nice for scalability. So from that point on, the manager will actually take a bit of a backseat, and it will do some logging, but it won't be actively involved in the simulation. Next slide, please. So as for coupling a model to muscle, this involves using the libmuscle API. You don't have to implement an API. You're using a library and calling functions. So, for example, the main loop of the cell model, which is the macro model, would look approximately like this. We make a message. So we start the loop. The first thing we need to do is produce some output. So we make a message where we send the current simulation time optionally, but I've included it here, the next simulation time, so for the next time step. And then in this case, it would be the geometry of the artery that can be used by the blood flow model. We send that on the geom out port, which is kind of an abstract hole in the side of the model through which we can send and receive messages. So exactly where that message goes, we don't know. It's not of our concern. We trust the muscle and the configuration to sort that out for us. Then we need to update our state, for which we need boundary conditions. So we go and ask muscle. Instances is a muscle object, so that represents our instance to the muscle simulation. And we ask muscle to receive on our wall shear stress import the current wall shear stress. And again, we trust that to magically appear on our doorstep whenever we need it. And that's guaranteed to happen because of the MMSF and the way that the coupling works. So we can then use that information to update our state, increment our time step, and keep looping. Muscle will automatically run the micro model as often as needed. So we can stop this loop at any point in time, and muscle will automatically stop calling the blood flow model in this case. Next slide, please. There's a little bit more to this API, but I refer you to the documentation to see that. So what can we do with this? Peter mentioned uncertainty quantification. Here is the same case I showed before. So this is black box uncertainty quantification, except done fully in muscle. So on the right, we can see that we have our original model without any changes. None of the code is different. The only thing is that we have n instances, where n is as large as our computer will allow. In many cases, we don't have an exascale machine quite yet, at least not here. So we may not be able to afford having as many instances simultaneously in a single allocation as we want to have samples. So we can solve this by adding a load balancer. The sampler component at the top left will just produce samples, as many as we want. So we'll produce parameter sets, one per desired sample. And it's going to send those to a load balancer component, which will actually divide that work evenly over the n instances of our model that we actually have. None of the code here has changed. The sampler is a generic component, the load balancer is a generic component, and all our models are completely unaware that they are part of an ensemble. So they will get their parameter actually from muscle, except that now they will not come from the central configuration file, which would ordinarily be the case, but they are actually injected into the simulation by the sampler via the load balancer. And this is all built in, so it happens for you. You don't have to think about it. Next slide, please. So that's a black box uncertainty quantification. We don't, strictly speaking, need muscle for this, but when we start doing the semi-intrusive methods, we do. And this is an example of this from a recent paper on uncertainty quantification patterns. What we see here is a macro-micro multiscale simulation, where we assume that the macro model is relatively cheap, so we can easily set up n instances, but the micro model is very expensive. So we are going to make a smaller ensemble of only m instances. Then what we do is on every time step, we receive the messages from the n macro model instances. We take the first m of those, we send them down to the micro models, they run in parallel. And then we're going to take all that information, the inputs, the outputs, and remaining inputs, send those to a separate component, which is called the interpolator, which will actually use interpolation based on the real model outputs to produce the remaining return values, or inputs for the remaining macro models. So those get sent back, and that will continue to loop, again, without any changes to any of the models. So you can just insert these components to have a more optimal simulation. Next slide, please. So that brings me to my final slide, which is about ongoing and future work. Muscle 3 is currently available, but it's also still in development. So one thing I'm currently working on is to integrate QCG pilot job support so that Muscle can allocate resources and start models for you. You still have to do that in your job script at the moment, which is a bit annoying. I would like to add built-in helper components like the load balancer, which is in the examples as in the documentation, but it's not integrated with the system. I would have to have a launcher, which actually launches it on a cluster from your laptop. There's profiling, which is partially implemented but needs to be finished. And once you have profiling output, you can actually do some rather advanced scheduling here. So that will be interesting. Finally, as for performance and scalability, partially that already works quite well because of the peer-to-peer connections. But for very large ensembles, for instance, you may run into problems with running out of ports, because if you want to connect to 1 million instances, you need a lot of ports to be able to do that. So that's something where we may need to do something like spreading a component over multiple nodes, or dropping connections and reestablishing them, or maybe using RDMA. I'm not sure yet. So if you want to have a look at it, the code is on GitHub. It's open source under the Apache license. The documentation is also online, and you can reach me by email if you have any questions later. That's it for me. Thank you. If you have any other questions, I'd like to.
One question in the Q&A, which I think is probably more focused towards what Peter was saying, is that how do you verify the validity of your surrogate model?
Well, yeah, that's all part of what has to be considered. For example, we want to get rid of having to do all these molecular dynamics simulations. What we're doing, if you remember, at each quadrature point, we have to launch MD simulations. And because MD itself is stochastic, it has a massive aleatoric component to the uncertainty. In other words, the initiation and the random seed influence the properties that you get much more strongly, actually, than the individual choice of parameters in the MD simulation. Therefore, you have to run ensembles of simulations down at that level. And so what we need to understand is the statistics and the distributions that you get from MD. And you may or may not be surprised if I tell you that this is quite a hot topic just in molecular dynamics, since most people who do it tend to think you only need to run one MD simulation. How wrong can you be? The distributions that we see from molecular dynamics are often not Gaussian, they're non-normal distributions. And we need to know what that is. And we therefore have to replace them by a surrogate that describes that type of distribution accurately. And so there are various ways of doing it. Some of them are called Gaussian process emulators, and other things are direct machine learning with neural networks. And those are things that we are, honing for those type of applications. Depends on which one you're in, which technique might work well. But sometimes you get instabilities occurring where the coupled model actually just totally breaks down when you connect that surrogate to the upper level, say. Is that okay, Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And I think we'll just leave it there. Maybe if there's any more questions around that, because